You'll go to hell if you've lived in sin. So say your prayers, 'cause here comes Grim.
Hello lovelies, I'm terrible at pimping my stuff, so here I am, pimping my stuff. Please like, subscribe, and most important of all, share, so that people can discover me and all the wonders that I offer. Hello lovelies, today we're getting a little potted history of my role-playing Genesis, and we're also getting a review of a game. Not this one, not this one, not even this one, but this one. But it is important to give some context, I think. So, 1975, baby Grim is born. This is widely regarded as a bad move. 1982, if I remember correctly, The Warlock of Firetop Mountain is published, the first in a long line of fighting fantasy books. And me, through my primary school friend Russell, discover the fighting fantasy books and devour them as rapidly as we can get hold of them. He ended up buying more than me. Don't really know how or why, but he did. And we would play through them together, with one person reading the text and the other person making the decisions. And the same with a couple of other friends of mine. So in a way, we were kind of proto-role-playing before we knew what role-playing really was, taking a single-player experience and extrapolating it out into a multiplayer experience. Then out came Steve Jackson's Fighting Fantasy, which took the rules, the simple ones that existed in the Fighting Fantasy books, and didn't really change them very much, but extrapolated them out into a way in which you could play more like a proper role-playing game. This would have been 1984? Yeah, so I was 7, 9, when we started role-playing properly, and then I guess 11. I think it was actually younger, maybe 10, maybe 11, when I went and got Middle-earth Role-Playing. There was a little model shop in Basingstoke that doesn't exist anymore, in a shopping part of Basingstoke that doesn't exist anymore, and they had MERP on the shelf in a box, and I bought that and Battle Cars, both of which I still have. This is not my original book. That one's too fragile to show on camera, but we managed to score another one. So this would have been... This is the second edition, but I don't know if it's the original printing. So yeah, 1985, 1986. Now, this is a little bit weird because Games Workshop put out a version of MERP that was the first edition rules in 1985 with a lovely Chris Akios cover. But somehow that's not the one I ended up with. I guess the model shop that I bought my games at must have got an import of the second edition or something, or it was just the newest version to the market and Games Workshop weren't fulfilling anymore. Middle-earth was based off Rolemaster. If you know anything about your history of role-playing games, you'll know that Rolemaster is not the easiest place to start your role-playing career, I guess, your full-on proper RPG, not to diss Fighting Fantasy. But somehow we muddled through, and I learned to roleplay from that through my love of Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, Tolkien in general, listening to the BBC radio play version, all of that sort of thing. And it's interesting to compare MERP as a slimmed down version of Rolemaster and as a game book for playing within the world of Middle-earth against the Darkmaster, which is a kind of retroclone of a simplified Rolemaster, very much drawing inspiration from MERP, but not actually being MERP, right? This is... how many pages? 128 pages almost entirely of rules, with little bits of extra information here and there, drawings of key characters from the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit, all of that sort of thing, right? And it's not especially concerned with replicating what you might know or expect from the Lord of the Rings, though it does have a lot of racial options that weren't necessarily obvious except from the expanded Tolkien Apocrypha and so on. So things you wouldn't even remember being mentioned in the books, turn up here. And I do say races because here we're talking about different types of humans and different types of elves. So it's applicable rather than species. Oh, that's a whole other discussion I guess we need to have at some point. But it's almost entirely rules because they assume that you know a lot about the Lord of the Rings. And so rather than giving you masses of background information, it kind of limits itself to statistics, dungeon creation, bestiary, those sorts of things. It did come with a solo adventure that you could play through, and some maps, and some very nice cardboard standees. I unfortunately don't have all of those anymore, but I've got most of them around somewhere. But rather than exhausting you with background information, it gives you a reading list. So like a primer on Tolkien to help you, figure out the world for yourself. So yeah, it's rather a slim volume, and it's mostly rules, and it was kind of intimidating as a kid, but I muscled through. I liked reading, I was reasonably good at maths, and I loved Tolkien. If I hadn't loved Tolkien, I think that may have been an end to my role-playing career, but yeah, there we go. Things turned out differently, much to some people's chagrin. So that brings us to Against the Darkmaster. Now, it's interesting that this is a kind of retroclone of older Rolemaster, of the simpler, in inverted commas, version of Rolemaster that was MERP, because this is a much bigger book, and also because whatever's left of Iron Crown Enterprises after they filed for bankruptcy in 1999, they've kind of limped along doing stuff with Rolemaster, and they have some new product out that's shot straight to the top of drive-thru RPG sales. So I hope the rump of ice is doing well, but we're talking about this. Now, compared to our 128 pages, this is 560 pages, so it's even bigger than Whitechester, and something I used to gauge the price I should be charging, to be honest. And again, like MERP, there's not really a great deal in terms of setting information here, but you can see how the graphic design has changed. There's a lot more negative space. There's a lot more fluff. The explanations are more expansive and so forth. There's a lot more art quality. I guess it depends on your point of view. I have a soft spot for the old school art, but there's echoes of that here. And this is much more of a kind of metal version, I guess, or at least that seems to be the inspiration behind it for the creator. So there's no set world here. There are certain assumptions about character types, races, species, all the rest. Right? It's a little bit even more open than MERP was, with more options than MERP was, but through applying modifications to more kind of centralized species, I guess, species, peoples, races, whatever you happen to want to call it. A lot of it will be familiar. A lot of it's more expansive into what you would think of as evil races, but that, you can change that. Like, why would you let someone play an orc? Well, I guess you might. But there's no set setting, right? There's a lot of implied setting, but you come up with your own Dark Lord for everyone to oppose. a lot of this will be familiar to people who are familiar with Rolemaster or MERP. Stats generally run 1 to 100. You get ranks in skills that improve your capability. There's a lot of random generation if you're into that sort of thing for developing your characters. Cultures is like a template that you apply on top of race rather than necessarily individuating every single possible permutation of those races. So you could be a human from the desert, you could be a dark elf from the sea. You can apply these cultures to your characters in a way that mix and matches, and it's kind of reminiscent of the Iron Kingdoms RPG, the one that was their own system, where you built a character by having a sort of pair of classes and a culture. So it feels kind of similar to that. So you got your typical class vocations. I'm still never really a fan of classes. I find them too restrictive. I prefer much more open systems. There's nothing to stop you allowing a kind of multi-classing, but it's obviously not the default. And that's something you find with a lot of old school games. They tend to replicate that more kind of restrictive niche protection sort of stuff. You get skills which you roll on. You're rolling a D100 and adding bonuses and trying to get over a number. And if you get really, really high on your roll, then you get special effects and stuff, which was always the great thing about Rolemaster and MERP was the critical hit tables. I love those. If you've read Blood, the horror RPG, which we'll need to do a new edition of at some point. There's a few things to make heroes stand out, like drive, the heroic path, how you can pass on things to your children or your apprentices or your successors, in whichever way you want to do it. So it's meant for long, epic kind of play where things can be inherited down the way. Now, MERP always suffered from the fact that everybody was given magic to one degree or another, or at least it seemed like it, and that was never really fitting with the low magic kind of setting that Middle-earth really was. A result of trying to crowbar the Rolemaster system, albeit in simplified form, into the setting, I think. Here, there's no rules other than those you choose to create for your setting, so it feels much more open and capable, but I didn't quite grok the magic system on first reading. So that takes a little bit more effort to understand how it all goes together and how the roles and so on work. So that's not necessarily explained in the best way, perhaps. This is a toolkit, really, for creating darker versions of Tolkien-esque epic fantasy or other epic fantasy games with a heavy metal twist. It might be what if Sauron won, for example, might be a kind of setting that you want. You're struggling against one of these great evils, and there are tables and so on to generate your own great evil for your campaign. But it's got a much darker, more pessimistic bent to it by default than something like The Lord of the Rings does. So while you could use this easily to recreate experiences from playing MERP or playing MERP modules and so on, it really wouldn't take much effort to do so. And MERP had some of the best Tolkien modules that there have ever been, describing the world in much greater detail and presenting you settlements and so on. It wouldn't be too difficult to do. You just might have to fiddle a bit with some of the capabilities and so on to make it work in the more hopeful way that Tolkien's world works. This is much darker. I mean, MERP and Rolemaster have always been brutal. One bad crit and a character dies, or as happened once, a halfling with a short bow taking out a Balrog with one hit. So you might want to moderate it, but that's a story worth telling. That time you one-shotted the Balrog. So these systems create stories, and that's how I think this kind of game is best used. You have an overarching goal to defeat the Darkmaster, whoever and whatever they are, and otherwise it's a travelogue and an open story. There are good travel rules and so on about how you move about the world, how you make alliances, how you unite people or seek out artifacts and so on that might help you against him. So you make it a more open world, a kind of purpose-driven hex crawl, I suppose, would be the way to do it. It's not a huge amount in the way of world creation, but there is in terms of creating the Darkmaster, their name, their powers, their minions, dark magic that serves them, that sort of thing, what happens when you defeat them. So that's nice. It's a good toolkit, and there are several examples of the kind of Darkmasters that you might want to go up against, suitably on black pages, in contrast with the rest of the book. So what makes this, as a rules book, which it is primarily a rules book, so big and expensive? Partially font size and layout, I think. Partially the inclusion of a lot more art than the old school games had. Also a lot of explanation and options, how to do things, how to modify the rules for a low magic campaign or a high magic campaign. Additional class specific to the low magic campaign. There's a lot of advice and hand-holding and explanation and so on, which is missing from the older school games necessarily. Now, in some ways that was good, because you had to learn to improvise, to kit bash the rules, to add things yourself, because the early games were so scant and empty of material. And it is definitely possible to go too far the other way, which I think is part of the reason that 5th edition games are so homogenous and dull and boring, and why they're all Fantasy Seattle, as Pundit puts it, is because there is too much hand-holding, and the philosophy is that everything exists in every game, rather than leaving it up to the Games Master, or Dungeon Master if you prefer, to decide for themselves. I think Dungeon Masters, despite being the core audience for games, have been disempowered by things like 5th edition D&D. The idea of the Games Master as the arbiter of the rules, the guardian of the rules, the narrator and creator of the world, the person the buck stops with, has been undermined. For some games that's fine. If you're playing a meta level to create a story together, then the Games Master's role is more limited, and that can certainly work. But a game like this is refreshingly all about options. You can do this, you can do that. If you want to do some kind of special maneuver in combat, it doesn't give you an exhaustive list of special maneuvers in combat. It says, okay, you've got the option, here's some guidelines how you can decide to do it. And that's become a bit of a litmus test for me with games. Like, I don't want to just hit him with my sword, right? Maybe I want to parry or riposte, or maybe I want to sweep his legs out from under him, or throw dirt in his eyes, or kick him in the balls. The kind of things that you get up to in fights, tricks and tactics and so on that vary according to the enemy. Most games don't allow you that kind of level of improvisation, and it's a shame. And so, yeah, it's something I'm trying to put into my games, and for me it's a litmus test for other games now. Excuse me. But this has it. Even if it's just 2 pages, that really elevates the game for me. and is indicative of the philosophy behind it. So it's more pages because, in a good way, it's giving you more options and guidelines and suggestions and optional rules, and it's a much bigger toolkit than, say, MERP was. And it's much less dry. It's an easier book to read. Excuse me, it's bastard cold here, and it's not doing me any good. And my partner has decided to be the Snow Witch from Lion the Witch and the Wardrobe and not allow us to have the heating on. So, always winter, never Christmas. There's not a great deal more to say. It's a good, solid RPG system. It's old school, but it's not D&D, and it's not D&D in a way that I always liked. You know, MERP was my first proper role-playing game. I didn't play D&D until at least a couple of years later at secondary school, and no, sir, I didn't like it compared to the experience I was used to. There is an adventure. I still think that's a waste of time. In a lot of RPG books, it's something that should be hived off separate. I mean, it's useful to an extent because it tells you how they intend the game to be played, what the kind of atmosphere and so on they're aiming for is. But you could just tell me. As it is, you know, this is always a bunch of pages that you're going to use maybe once, if you use it at all, and then it's just dead weight. And there's I think there's several adventures in here. So to me, that is a waste of time, a waste of space. It's not something I care about or want in my books, especially big toolkit books like this. Do handily collect all the tables. These can look intimidating when they're all collected together, but if you've been through the book and taken them in piecemeal, it's not such a bother. And it's less intimidating than it was in MERP or certainly Rolemaster. The bestiary is okay. Not great guidelines for creating your own monsters in the game world, but yeah, it's okay. So, it's a toolkit. It's a big, fat, heavy toolkit. It's a big, fat, heavy toolkit that calls back more to the MERP and perhaps even RuneQuest tradition, with a tinge of heavy metal from the times back in the day. As such, it ticks a nostalgia box for me, but it is updated and it's easier to learn and to understand, and it will certainly give a different experience to a lot of other old school RPGs and other retroclones. It's a bit of a beast. It's a bit expensive. It's powered by Open00 or Open100, something I didn't even know existed. So I guess that means that a version of the Rolemaster system is open license now. Yeah, it's just the wasted space on the adventures, I think, that bugs me. Okay, so style. It's implicit. It's a toolkit. It's not hugely stylistic. The layout is fine. It tells you what you need to know. The black and white artwork is striking, and limiting yourself to black and white means it's not muddy, makes it easier to read for me. Some people prefer a more grey background. You will find that on some pages. But it's nice and clean and functional, but it's not particularly stylish. The writing is much more accessible than the old games. Style, I guess 4 for style. In terms of substance, you can't hugely fault it, but it does waste a lot of time and space, which is something you could certainly never say MERP did, with its enormous block paragraphs and tiny font. So in terms of substance, there's a lot there, but it could have done with being a little bit more sparse, I think, and losing some page count to make the book a bit more wieldy and less deadly, less of a backbreaker to carry around. So, Substance 4. So Star 4, Substance 4, 8 out of 10, 4 out of 5. I would recommend it, particularly if you have nostalgia or if you want an old school experience that is different to D&D. Yeah, we were talking about that recently, saying there are more old school experiences than endless variations on Dungeons and Dragons, and this is one of them, and as such should be encouraged. Zang. Imagination is a deeply personal game about depression and its effects, intended to help people with invisible illnesses to broach the subject and explore it in a way in which they can have power over it. Imagination is set after the fall of mainland Britain to a strange reality breakdown. The barriers between imagination and reality, dreams and nightmares, have shattered, and strange things dreamed up by people caught in the event teem across the land. Only those whose minds are already broken can hope to cope with exploring, understanding, and combating this strangeness for the sake of the huddled refugees that sit and wait and watch from the smaller islands around the coast. A game of mental illness and art using the description system as used in Neverwhere. This game is available free, so please promote, download, host and spread as far and wide as you can. Available at post-mort.com and drive-through RPG.
Just another rock casualty, getting high on mental casualty. Just another rock casualty, getting high on mental casualty. They took your minds. They took your minds away.
This is horrible what happened today. See, I don't like the, I have, okay, like a lot of you, I hate a lot. You know? But I hate with style and creativity. Yeah!